Welcome back to Parking Full Time. I'm Big Dave the Parker. And I want to welcome you to this Bible study and prayer time. The goal of Parking Full Time is to display the glory of God's creation by exploring America one park at a time. The God who created this world is also the God who sent his son Jesus to save this world. And that's what these Bible study and prayer time videos are designed to explore. Right now we're studying through the Gospel of John, and in this video we're going to look at the first half of John chapter 6. A couple of caveats or warnings about this Bible study. First, if you are familiar with Bibles, you'll notice that I'm using the King James Version of the Bible for this Bible study. There are a few reasons for that. One of them is that the King James Version is the only relatively recent version of the Bible that is not copyrighted. I can't take a copy of the NASB, for example, and put it on camera and send it all over the world legally like I'm doing with the King James right now. That's a copyright violation. With the King James, I can do that, and I can do that legally. Second, the view I'm going to present in this Bible study is the conservative independent Baptist view. And I know that not everybody in the kingdom of God is that way, but that's the way I am. And I'm the one doing this Bible study. We have a lot of verses to cover today, so let's get right into John chapter 6 and verse 1. Verse 1 starts, "After these things," so a period of time passes. That phrase, "after these things," it designates an undetermined period of time, so we don't know how long, but some time passes between the end of chapter 5, what we studied last time, and the start of chapter 6. And so it says here, "After these things, Jesus went over the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias." Those are two different names for the same body of water. "And a great multitude followed him, because they saw his miracles which he did on them that were diseased." The important thing here is the reason these people are following him. They were following him because they saw his miracles. Because they saw his miracles. They didn't believe in who he was. They just wanted to see more miracles. Now, this kind of belief, this kind of following him, has come up a couple of times previously in this Bible study. So let's go back and let's look at a couple of those. It came up at the end of chapter 2. And so if we flip back to John chapter 2, and we look at verses 23 and 24 down here at the very end of chapter 2, it says, "Now when he was in Jerusalem, when Jesus was in Jerusalem at the Passover, in the feast day, many believed in his name when they saw the miracles which he did." They believed in him, but not because of who he was, not because he was the Lamb of God who came to take away the sin of the world. They believed in him because of the miracles. They just wanted to see more miracles. And notice Jesus' response here. He says, "But Jesus did not commit himself unto them, because he knew all men." And I made the point back when we studied chapter 2 that the word for believed and the word for commit is actually the same root word in the Greek. So this kind of belief, this believing in him for the miracles, this kind of belief that they had, that's not the kind of belief that Jesus was trying to inspire. So it came up there. It came up again last week. So last week, the last video that we did at the end of chapter 5, we saw that the miracles were one of the witnesses of who Jesus is. At the end of chapter 5, Jesus gives a long list of witnesses, people and things that witnessed of who he was, witnessed that he is the Son of God and God the Son. And we looked at chapter 5 and verse 36 right here. And it says, "But I have greater witness than that of John." The witness of John the Baptist was one of the witnesses that Jesus had given of who he was. He says, "But I have greater witness than that of John, for the works which the Father hath given me to finish, the same works that I do bear witness of me, that the Father hath sent me." And last time I underlined the phrase "the works" here, and I wrote in beside that, "the miracles." When he talks about the works, he's talking about the miracles that he had done, the miracles that were a witness, that were a proof of who he was. You see, the miracles should have indicated to anyone who saw them who he was, but to them it didn't. And it's the same with God's creation today. The purpose of parking full time is to display the glory of God's creation, but we don't want to stop there. You see, the creation points to the Creator. That's who you really want to see the glory of. That's who you want to believe in. But they didn't get that here. They didn't get the fact that the miracles were a witness of him and who he was. So we have that same issue here in verse 2. So they followed him because of the miracles. And so now getting back into John chapter 6, so continuing in verse 3. And Jesus went up into a mountain, and there he sat with his disciples. And the Passover, a feast of the Jews, was nigh. When Jesus then lifted up his eyes and saw a great company come unto him, a lot of people had come to him, started following him just because of the miracles. He saith unto Philip, Philip was one of his disciples. We met him back in chapter 1. So he says to Philip, where shall we buy bread, that these may eat? And this he said to prove him, for he himself knew what he would do. Now, a little bit of what we saw before. We met Philip back in chapter 1. He was one of the first people, one of the first followers of Jesus. He started following Jesus because of the witness of John the Baptist and the other people who followed him. People like Peter, people like Andrew, who followed him because of that. We know from chapter 1 that Philip was from this area. He was from the area that was over the Sea of Galilee, or the Sea of Tiberias. And so if Jesus was really looking for some place to buy bread, so that they could buy bread so that he could feed these people, Philip would have been the right person to ask, because he was from the area. As most of you know, as part of Parking Full Time, I write pizza reviews. And when I'm in a new area, an area that I'm not familiar with the pizzas in that area, and I'm looking for a pizza to review, usually what I do is I ask the hotel clerk if they know any good local pizzas. And why do I ask the hotel clerk? Well, because they're from around there. They know where the good pizzas are, or at least you'd think they would know. So it makes sense to ask Philip here. It makes sense to ask him where they should buy bread that all these people may eat. But verse 6 makes it clear that's not really the reason that Jesus is asking Philip. That's not really what he has in mind here. Verse 6 tells us that this he said to prove him. Okay, to prove him. The Greek word is translated prove here. It carries the idea of a test. And so I'm going to write that down here. So beside prove, I'm going to write test. And this he said to test him. Okay? Jesus wanted to test Philip. He wanted to test Philip, one of his closest, one of his earliest disciples. Does Philip really understand who I am? And the Lord does that with us sometimes also. He'll let trouble come into our lives to test us, to see if we really trust in him, to take care of our problems, or whether we try to deal with our problems ourselves. Sometimes he lets trouble come into our lives so that we can learn to trust him more. And that's what he's doing here. He's asking Philip this question to test him, to prove him. And we'll see here the disciples don't do well on this test. Look at Philip's answer here in verse 7. Philip answered him, 200 pennyworth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them may take a little. Philip's thinking only in terms of their physical things, the things that they physically have. And the same is true here in verses 8 and 9. Verse 8, one of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, saith unto him, There is a lad here, which hath 5 barley loaves, and 2 small fishes, but what are they among so many? You see, both Philip and Andrew, when they look at this situation, they're only considering what they can see. They're considering the great number of people that need to eat, and they're considering the small amount of money in the case of Philip, or the small amount of food in the case of Andrew, that they actually have to hand. They're only considering what they can see They're not considering who Jesus is. They're not considering who Jesus is. You see, if we only make decisions based on what we can see, we're going to make some really bad decisions. Let me write a reference in here, and there's nowhere really to write it here, so I'll write it down here at the bottom of this page. 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 7. 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 7. The Apostle Paul is talking about the same situation, the same problem that these disciples are having here. The problem that they're only looking at what they can see. They're not considering who Jesus is. So let's take a look at that. 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 7. And it's a short little verse, but it's very powerful. So this is 2 Corinthians chapter 5. Okay? And look up here at the top of the next page at verse 7. It's a little parenthetical comment that Paul makes when he's writing his second letter, the second one we have preserved, to the Corinthians here. And he says, "For we walk by faith, not by sight. For we walk by faith, not by sight." Our walk is what we do on a daily basis, the decisions that we make on a daily basis. And Paul tells us here that the decisions we make on a daily basis, they should be based on faith. They should be by faith. They should be based on faith in what God's word says, not based on what we see, not by sight. You see, one of the things the Bible tells us that we've all sinned. It tells us that we've all done things that God has told us not to do, and we failed to do things that God has told us to do. And the Bible also tells us that the penalty for that sin is death, eternal separation from God. But it goes on to say we can have everlasting life. We can have that death penalty paid for. We can have that death penalty removed by believing in him. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him shall not perish, but have everlasting life. And when we do that, when we believe in him, it should change how we walk. It should change the decisions I make on a daily basis. I shouldn't just make decisions based on what I see anymore, based on sight. I should make decisions based on what his word says. We should walk by faith, not by sight. That's what Paul tells us here in 2 Corinthians. And it's what he's trying to get, it's what Jesus is trying to get his disciples to start doing back in the Gospel of John. So his disciples look only at what they can see. They look at the small amount of money and the small amount of food that they have to hand, the small amount relative to the large number of people who are there. And so here goes Jesus again. So he keeps trying to convince them of who he is, keeps trying to convince them to walk by faith in him and not by sight. So verse 10, "And Jesus said, Make the men sit down. Now there was much grass in the place. So the men sat down, in number about 5,000. Again, we're talking about a large number of people here. In verse 11, "And Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed to the disciples, and the disciples to them that were sit down, to the multitude, and likewise of the fishes as much as they would." They got to eat as much as they wanted to eat. Verse 12, "When they were filled, he said unto his disciples, Gather up the fragments that remain, that nothing be lost. Therefore they gathered them together, and filled 12 baskets with the fragments of the 5 barley loaves, which remained over and above unto them that had eaten." So you think about this here. They started with 5 barley loaves and 2 fishes, and they ended up with 12 baskets of fragments, in addition to all the food that had been consumed. That's a miracle. Right? And then verse 14, "Then those men which when they had seen the miracle that Jesus did," the fact that he had managed to make all of this food out of very little, said, this is of a truth that prophet that should come into the world." Now, we don't know how Jesus did this. We don't know how he made all of this bread and all of these fish, but he is the creator. He's showing them who he is. The theme verse of Parking Full Time, this project, is Colossians 1:16. All things were made by him and for him. He made everything that we see and everything we touch and feel, he made it all out of nothing. And he shows us here that, yes, he made everything out of nothing. He can make this fish and these fish and this bread, he can make that out of nothing too. But notice their reaction there. They said, this is of a truth that prophet that should come into the world. They're thinking of him just as another prophet. They still didn't get who he was. They didn't get that he was God the Son and the Son of God. So he tries again. He's really very patient with the people here. And I'm thankful for that because he's been very patient with me and he's very patient with you as well. So we see another miracle next. All right, so look at verse 15 here. When Jesus therefore perceived that they would come and take him by force to make him a king, again, they're interested in physical food and physical power, he departed again into a mountain himself alone. And when evening was come, when evening was now come, his disciples went down unto the sea, and entered into a ship, and went over the sea toward Capernaum. And it was now dark, and Jesus was not come to them. And the sea arose by reason of a great wind that blew. That was common on the Sea of Galilee. When the sun goes down, the wind would blow. You get great storms, great windstorms out on that sea because of the geography of the region. Then look at verse 19. So when they had rowed about 25 or 30 furlongs, they see Jesus walking on the sea and drawing nigh unto the ship, and they were afraid. I've read this passage here, and I thought about an incident that I heard about in a church up in Chicago a few years ago. The pastor was preaching on this particular passage, and he asked the congregation if any of them had ever walked on water, like Jesus does here, like Jesus comes walking on the sea. And after a few seconds, one hand in the back went up. And the pastor kind of incredulously said, so wait a minute, you walked on water? And the guy answered, yep, I walk on water every winter when it turns to ice. Cagey guy there. But this kind of miracle, walking on liquid water on the sea, only God can do this kind of miracle. And it says at the end of the verse, when they saw this, when they saw him coming close to the ship, it says they were afraid. Okay? I'll write in a reference here that I'm not going to turn to. I'll write in Matthew chapter 14, verse 26. And again, I'm not going to turn there, but in Matthew's account of this event, it says that the disciples thought they saw a ghost. Okay? You see, who he was and the power that he has, the power over creation that he has, it still doesn't register to them. But a ghost can't do what comes next. Look at verses 20 and 21. But he saith unto him, a ghost can't talk like this, but he saith unto them, it is I, be not afraid. Then they willingly received him into the ship. A ghost can't physically climb into the ship either. And immediately the ship was at the land whither they went. Immediately they were at the destination they were going to. A similar reference to the Matthew reference on this, again, this is another account of this particular story. I'm going to write in Mark chapter 6, verse 47. And again, I'm not going to turn there. But it tells us that this event, Mark specifically tells us this event happens in the middle of the sea. So if you just think about this geographically for a minute, if he comes to them walking on the sea in the middle of the sea, and then immediately they were at land, they were at their destination, well, that would be yet another miracle. And some people dispute that idea, but the point is, they willingly received Jesus into the ship. Notice here at the beginning of verse 21, then once he spoke to them, once they realized that this isn't a ghost, this is actually Jesus, then they willingly received him into the ship. And as soon as they did that, as soon as they willingly received him into the ship, their journey, their trouble, the storm that they were dealing with on the sea, their troubles were over. And it's the same way with us. You see, when you trust in Him, instead of trusting in yourself, your real troubles are finished. Now, we still have some bad things happen to us, and we still have someone who's trying to destroy us, the devil trying to destroy us, trying to destroy our testimonies. But we have someone beside us who can and will take care of those troubles. I'll give you another reference here. It's another reference from Corinthians, 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 8 through 10. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 8 through 10. And Paul writes about the help that he gives us when we're troubled. So I flipped over here to 2 Corinthians chapter 4, and notice what Paul said. The Apostle Paul, he had a lot of trouble in the ministry that he did for the Lord here. But notice he says here, we are troubled on every side. We have troubles, yet not distressed. We are perplexed. We see things that don't make any sense to us, but not in despair. Persecuted, but not forsaken. Cast down, but not destroyed. Always bearing about in the body the dying of the Lord Jesus, that the life also of Jesus might be made manifest in our body. You see, the key thing is here in verse 10, the key thing is the Lord Jesus. The key thing is trusting in Him. And that's when we have people try to trouble us, and we do, people try to trouble us, but we aren't distressed. We have people do things that don't make any sense to us, that perplex us, but we don't despair. We have people persecute us, but we're not forsaken. We get cast down, like a clay pot gets cast to the ground, but we don't get destroyed. And the only way you can have this, the only way to live a life like this, is by trusting in the Lord. Instead of trying to deal with all your problems and deal with all your confusion and deal with all the persecution and deal with all the beatings that we take, instead of trying to deal with it yourself, trust in the Lord to deal with it. That's how you can claim this promise here. Now, back in John, these miracles lead to another argument. I mentioned last time that most of chapters 5 through 10 are arguments that Jesus has with people, trying to persuade them of who He is. And we see that again now. So let's look at verse 22 here. The day following, when the people which stood on the other side of the sea saw that there was none other boat there, save that one wherein His disciples were entered, and that Jesus went not with His disciples into the boat, but that His disciples were gone away alone. So they assessed the situation of the physical boats that were there, trying to figure out where He went. Howbeit there came other boats from Tiberias nigh unto the place where they had eat bread. After that, the Lord had given thanks. Okay? And then here's what they did, verse 24. When the people therefore saw that Jesus was not there, neither His disciples, they also took shipping, they got in boats, and came to Capernaum, seeking for Jesus. At this time, Capernaum was Jesus' home base, and so that would be the logical place to look for Him. If you're looking for Jesus to look at His home base, that would be the logical place to look. And they find Him, verse 25. And when they had found Him on the other side of the sea, they said unto Him, Rabbi, when camest thou hither? When did you come over here? Verse 26, Jesus answered them and said, Verily, verily, truly, truly, I say unto you, ye seek me not because ye saw the miracles, but because ye did eat of the loaves and were filled. Again, just like we talked about when we went back to John chapter 5, they weren't considering the significance of the miracles. The fact that the miracles are a witness of who He is. They just wanted more physical food to eat. Okay? And so He tries to deal with that now. Now we get into the argument where He's trying to persuade them of who He is and trying to show them the faith that they need to have in Him. So He tells them in verse 27, Labor not for the meat which perisheth, for physical food, but for that meat which endureth unto everlasting life. That's the key thing Jesus keeps trying to impress upon them. Our need for everlasting life, the need to have that death penalty that we have for our sins removed. So labor not for the meat which perisheth, but for that meat which endureth unto everlasting life, which the Son of Man shall give unto you, for him hath God the Father sealed. Then they said unto him their response, What shall we do that we might work the works of God? Jesus answered and said unto them, This is the work of God, that ye believe on him whom he hath sent. And him who he hath sent, that's Jesus. I've circled this word a bunch of times throughout this study, and I'm going to circle it again. The word believe, that is the key word in the Gospel of John. Jesus tells them over and over and over again that everlasting life, this thing that you really need to seek for, the thing that you really need to have your death payment removed, the only way to have that is by believing. They asked him here in verse 28, what do we do that we might start working the works of God? And he tells them, you can't do anything. You don't start by doing anything. You have to start by believing to have everlasting life. But they still didn't get it. Look at verse 30 here. They said therefore unto him, What sign showest thou then, that we may see and believe thee? What dost thou work? Our fathers did eat manna in the desert. As it is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat. Now, you need a little bit of historical background to understand how this argument, this conversation, leads to manna and this bread from heaven. So let's go take a look at this. I'm going to write in here, I'll write it over here. Exodus chapter 16, verse 15. Okay. Exodus chapter 16 and verse 15. And I'm not going to turn there, but it talks about how God provided manna, which literally is bread from heaven. How God provided manna while the Jews were in the wilderness after leaving Egypt and heading to the Promised Land. And these people he's talking to here, they're Jews. And so what they're really asking him to do when they when they say, Our fathers did eat manna in the desert, what they're really asking him to do is they're asking Jesus to duplicate or surpass that physical miracle so that they could have more bread to eat. But that's not why Jesus was there. Look at his response here, verse 32 and 33. Then Jesus said unto them, Verily, verily, I say unto you, Moses gave you not that bread from heaven, but my Father giveth you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is he which cometh down from heaven, and giveth life unto the world. Now it's going to become clear that he's speaking of himself there, but again, they don't get that, so they answer verse 34. Then said they unto him, Lord, evermore give us this bread. Again, they're thinking in terms of physical bread they can eat. And what his answer here is very important. So look at verse 35. And Jesus said unto them, I am the bread of life. I am the bread of life. Okay. This is a very important phrase here. Okay. I am the bread of life. Okay. And I want to spend most of the rest of this video showing you why this phrase is so important. Throughout the Gospel of John, there are 7 I am sayings. 7 times when Jesus says, I am this or I am that. This time he says, I am the bread of life. And so I boxed that phrase and I put a 1 beside it here because we're going to study all 7 of them in due course. But today I want to dig into this phrase, I am the bread of life, the first of the I am sayings, and its significance. And to understand the significance of that, again, you need to look back to the Jews' background here. You need to look back to the Old Testament. So I'm going to write down another reference here from Exodus. It's Exodus chapter 3, verses 13 and 14. Exodus chapter 3, verses 13 and 14. So let's take a look at that. Again, this is the background. The people in Jesus' direct audience, they would have thought of Exodus chapter 3 immediately when he said, I am the bread of life. We probably don't because we don't have their background. But let me show you what they would have thought of. So go back to Exodus chapter 3 here, back towards the beginning of the Old Testament. Okay? This is Exodus chapter 3. Right? Exodus chapter 3. And look at verses 13 and 14. So Exodus chapter 3, verses 13 and 14. So the situation here is Moses is talking with God. God had called Moses. He called Moses to go to Egypt to lead the Jews, lead God's people out of Egypt. Right? Notice what he says here in Exodus chapter 3, verse 13. And Moses said unto God, Behold, when I come unto the children of Israel, and shall say unto them, The God of your fathers hath sent me unto you, which he had sent Moses to them in Egypt. And they shall say to me, What is his name? What shall I say unto them? So what name should I give them for you? What name should I give them for God? And notice God's answer here in verse 14. And God said unto Moses, I am that I am. And he said, Thus shalt thou say unto the children of Israel, I am hath sent me unto you. So when Moses asked God for his name, the name God gave him was, I am. And so getting back to Jesus' situation now, when Jesus said, I am such and such, he was claiming to be that God. He was claiming to be the God who 1,000 years earlier had sent Moses and given him the name I am to lead the Jews out of Egypt. And the people that Jesus is talking to here in John chapter 6, sorry, I got under the stand here. The people that Jesus is talking to here in John chapter 6, they would have immediately understood that. When he said, I am the bread of life, they would have understood that this I am here is a reference to the God of Exodus, the God that led the Jews out of Egypt. And we sometimes don't make that connection because we don't have the background they do, but they would have. Just like back in the previous chapter, back in chapter 5, when Jesus invokes the phrase, my Father. When Jesus answered them, he said, my Father worketh hitherto, and I work. And I talked about that in the previous video. When Jesus said, my Father, he was claiming to be God. And they understood that. They knew exactly what he was claiming. And it's the same with this and all of these I am sayings. When Jesus said, I am the bread of life, they knew exactly what he was claiming. He was claiming to be God. But would they believe it? So let's finish this block of text here. Okay. Verse 36, But I said unto you that ye also have seen me, and believe not. Okay. All that the Father giveth me shall come to me, and him that cometh to me I will in no wise cast out. For I came down from heaven, not to do mine own will, but the will of him that sent me. Just like the manna came down from heaven 1,000+ years earlier when the Jews were in the wilderness, when their fathers were in the wilderness, Jesus here was come down from heaven. Now he didn't come down to provide physical food, but he came down to do the will of him that sent me. He came to provide spiritual food. He came to provide everlasting life, to pay the death payment that we couldn't pay, so that we could have our death penalty removed and have everlasting life. And look at the last two verses for today, verses 39 and 40. And this is the Father's will which hath sent me, that of all which he hath given me, I should lose nothing. That's an important phrase there. Of all which he hath given me, I should lose nothing, but should raise it up again at the last day. And this is the will of him that sent me, that every one which seeth the Son and believeth on him, there's that phrase again, anyone who sees the Son and believes on him may have everlasting life, and I will raise him up at the last day. And that's it. By believing in him, we have everlasting life, and we have a future resurrection. We have this being raised up, this promise that we're going to be raised up at the last day. And notice also the promise here in verse 39, the promise that of all them that which he hath given me, I should lose nothing. Okay? Of all them which he hath given me, who has the Father given him? He's given him anyone who will believe in him. That all of them which he hath given me, I should lose nothing. You see, some people think that after believing in him, if you go and do something really bad, that you can lose your everlasting life. No, and that doesn't really make any sense. So first, if you could lose your everlasting life, it wouldn't be everlasting. Just think about logically, that doesn't make sense. But second, Jesus makes a promise here. He says, I should lose nothing. Of all which he hath given me, I should lose nothing. That is, he's not going to lose any of us. If you believe in him, he's not going to lose you. You have everlasting life, and you can't lose it. He won't let you lose it. I've done that. I've believed in him. I have this everlasting life. And I hope you do too. I hope you'll believe in him and have the everlasting life that he gives. We'll continue in John chapter 6 next time. I close each of these videos with a short prayer time. You can email prayer requests to parkingfulltime@gmail.com. That's the email account that I use to run this project. A few things I'm praying for right now. I'm praying for our country and its leaders. We desperately need that right now. I'm praying that more people will believe in him, that more people will have this everlasting life. I'm praying for power and protection for preachers of the gospel. There are a lot of people, a lot of evil forces that are trying to trouble us and perplex us and destroy us right now. So just pray that that won't happen, that he'll carry us through that. And I'm praying that new believers will grow. So I'm going to take a few minutes and pray for these things. I hope that you'll do the same. Until next time, I am Big Dave the Parker for Parking Full Time. Have a great afternoon. Take care, and Lord bless.